Hi, I'm Demarcus Jenkins. I am assistant professor at the University of Arizona in the Department of Education Policy Studies and Practice. Prior to returning to graduate school, I spent several years as a high school teacher and teacher trainer, teacher leader, as well as working in for district and state education policy spaces. So that's been my background.
Okay, Antar.
Hey, my name's Antar Tichavakunda. I use he, him pronouns. Originally from Washington, D.C., products of D.C. Public Schools. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati. I study from a sociological perspective, race and higher education. And yeah, prior to my doctoral work and my work right now, I was a teacher in D.C. I taught for a couple years. So yeah, that's what brings me to this work.
Great, hey everyone. My name is Justin Coles. Also excited to be here. And I am an assistant professor in curriculum and teaching at Fordham University in Manhattan, New York at the Graduate School of Education there. And my current role, I'm also a program coordinator for our English education program. And so my research is largely around I guess using the literacies of Black youth as a site to explore anti-Blackness and Blackness and sort of what that means for K-12 schooling. So.
I guess I did talk about my own research. I just sort of just jumped right in. But following the commentary of my colleagues, my research is primarily interested in spatial inequality and racialized spaces in and around schools. So trying to understand how Black students and Black people navigate racialized spaces in education, and what does that mean for how they come to make sense of their own identity and navigate school spaces.
Awesome. It's obviously your work all intersects, and so it kind of makes sense that you might come together and produce a piece of research specifically regarding critical race counterstories of police interactions with Black men on university campuses. But I guess I'm also curious, just from reading your paper, how did you all come to work together? Were you friends prior to graduate school? Did you kind of come together around this academic topic, or what's the story there?
We've come together. We've like our lives have intersected in so many different ways that for us to come together to write this piece was just synergistic, and it made sense. So I went to UCLA for graduate school, and Antar at the time was at USC for graduate school. So we met during the graduate school process. I think during that same year, or maybe the year after, Justin was getting ready to enroll in graduate school and considered UCLA as an option. So he and I met on his visit as he was, doing his world tour to figure out graduate school. We had the chance to meet in Los Angeles because of that. And I think the two of them went to undergrad together, so there was some connection through undergrad. All three of us are part of the same fraternity, so we're all members of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, so we were connected through that. We were all teachers, so there are just so many connections. We spent some time on the East Coast in DC and Philly, so it's just I don't know, we're like brothers. So we've been tightly connected for several years through different walks of life. Yeah, Antar.
Yeah, I've known Justin since 2007. Just wild to say. And actually another connection. I think Demarcus was a teacher in DC while I was finishing up high school. So we never crossed paths though. He taught in a different school,
That's his way of calling me old, is what he's doing.
But you can say he looks great. Come on. But yeah, no, we know each other. I mean, we wrote together, we partied together. I mean, and if you read the piece, and whoever's listening to it, please read the piece. If you can't get a PDF, email one of us and we'll shoot you a PDF. But yeah, like as we started the piece, like, you know, we weren't making it up. Like in the introduction, we were literally having drinks, maybe finishing up our first or second bottle, I'm not sure. And then it just, you know, this topic of policing came up kind of organically. So
Awesome. And I'd wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that article and specifically what's important about counter stories in research. I had actually come across the term before reading the article, and it's really interesting to compare that to, I think, some of the research that Jude and I do at Western and hear about as undergraduates. It's a very different way to approach the issue. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Seems like
Justin,
we'll be doing a bit of a dance here. So
yeah, you
bear
could.
with
You go
us.
ahead
I
and
know
jump
you all
in.
sent us questions, but we didn't meet prior to, so we'll be kind of, you know, you all do the edit thing. This idea of counter story, and I'm glad you did encounter it in this paper. So just, I guess if we think about it in relation to our work, there's this narrative around policing and sort of dominant society that is there to serve and protect. And sort of that opening quote from George Day sort of gives some insights into what that story is. And sort of many people across races, ethnicities, right, linguistic backgrounds, nationalities have come to believe that. Maybe their proximity to sort of state power, sort of, or whiteness, or whatever, right? And so the idea of a counter story is that also within this society and in this world, there are many people who sort of don't have that experience, that police are there to serve and protect. So just really the idea of the counter is that there is multiple truths that exist. And so sort of often we, because it's easy for us as humans, we commit ourselves to one truth, particularly sort of if the people, it benefits, right? Sort of the status quo of our society and the world. And it makes people feel good. And we don't have to do work to sort of change systems and policies when we can sort of convince everyone else that this is the only truth. And so really this coming from critical race theory, which Marcus and Antar can jump in and talk a little bit more about that if you all are curious about those origins. But it is simply that, it is that there are other truths out there and sort of those truths need to be heard and sort of really deserve to be heard. And one thing I'll just say briefly before ending, and our counter stories are a bit of both, but I want to clarify that a counter story in the critical race theory tradition does not always have to be sort of in response to sort of a dominant story or sort of literally countering it, but it's literally just a story that emerges from sort of voices that are sort of often not given a space or platform to be heard.
Yeah, I think Justin explained it very well and brilliantly. And the only thing that I'll add to that is for counter stories, I think for us, it's important that we do think about the voices and the perspectives that are traditionally outside of sort of the common sense or the sense making that dominant society has about particular ideas or topics, particularly police as it relates to our article. And so we use our stories, which in a lot of ways are outside of the broader social imaginary around what we come to understand police. So we use our story to say, hey, there's actually other experiences with campus police that do not fit this neat narrative of serving and protecting and enforcing, you know, law and order, right? There's not this, there's a different narrative. And there are folk who look like the three of us and you know, other Black male collegians across this nation who are experiencing campus police very differently. So what does it mean for us to be able to use our narratives to speak truth to power, to maybe in some ways think about how our narratives can incite policy change, and just transformational change across the way campuses do business as it relates to campus police and students of color, particularly Black students on college campuses.
And I'm sure that it seems like you have a very interesting relationship, all three of you, with police on campus and then also being Black men as you've gone through the whole undergraduate to graduate to now working at a university. And I guess one thing that I'm curious about also, I guess for my own interest in maybe going further into academia is, how do you see your counter stories play out? Do you feel like you are getting responses from your university? Do you feel like you can talk about it as faculty members or with your students as well?
I'll jump in to start. Um, well, it's tough, right? I think we published this. Well, it came out, with Race, Ethnicity, and Education, the journal, at a time like right before, like a little bit like before what happened as the summer of 2020, which will be known in history. I'm not sure what, but it's somewhat of a racial reckoning. This came out before that, right? And one of the things we noticed collectively was like there's so I mean, at the time of us writing it, as we list in our in the article, there was so little research on campus policing at all. Like it was just completely taken for granted in the higher education sphere, and probably to an extent in the K-12 sphere. But I think there's more work in K-12, but still very much taken for granted. Part of the status quo, as Justin was saying, kind of like thinking about the dominant narrative of how schooling and education is supposed to look. Oh, of course you have campus police officers, right? And so I think our work in some ways unsettled that, at least on the scholarly realm, and I think gathered somewhat, we got some attention through that. But I think now, if you look at more of the work, like we see calls for like police-free campuses and such, right? I know Charles Davis and Jude Paul Dizon, if I pronounce the name, I'm sorry. He's at USC. Charles Davis is at University of Michigan. Came out with a piece in Inside Higher Ed and also in the, I think, New York Times. It's about why we need police abolition in higher education. And they actually referred to our piece as well. So I think it's been taken up usefully. Obviously, I mean, it's good for our work to be useful, but I know I personally hate that it's so relevant, even when I initially presented this topic presented our paper at this big higher education conference called ASH, I remember, in the crowd, in the audience, a lot of Black men, they like after I, presented the paper, presented the topic, which will later become our paper, so many Black men were just raising their hands like, I had another experience, and they shared it. Someone else, I had this other experience. And it wasn't necessarily like us discussing the topic or our paper. It turned into a space of us like, wow, like we all have this shared experience of using a second ID or of some sort to justify our being in education spaces. But I'll stop right there.
Yeah, if I could jump in. Thank you, Antar, because that just really helped think. So when we think about the counter stories and the ways it's being picked up, I think one thing that it's important for us to consider and to think about is, I guess, like the beauty and tragedy sometimes of the counter story. And so I think that there's often there can be a sense of shame, I think, when we think about this, and I think campuses and higher ed folks need to think about what that means. And I think about in my counter story that I share here, around the unruly Black, despite the incident, and particularly because this wasn't something that was talked about often, I talk about how I actually was punished at the end of all of this, and so there's this thing that you think, okay, I'm in college, right? I've arrived to some extent. I think particularly for folks of color and Black folks who go to these predominantly white campuses, and you somehow convince yourself that you are the troublemaker, right? You did something in this sort of white space that you should not have done, despite it being, deep in your heart that it was not appropriate. But the systems and the ways anti-Blackness is so embedded. And I think even when we were talking, and I did first share this story, and why really I never talked about it outside of that, because there wasn't a space to, and there wasn't the narrative, right? There wasn't this narrative that I could just talk about campus police being racist and anti-Black, although we know that to be true. And so I think there's a lot of work that we all need to continue to do to really just provide spaces. So again, I'm thankful for you all for even allowing us to further talk about this work. And even we see with Antar at the conference, people needing that space to be invited in. And so I think that's the first step that campuses what we really need to start to do to make the problem visible, because we know it's there, but again, it is invisibilized.
And I think part of the problem, and we didn't realize it until this year, and even for Jude, I think Jude talked down her position. Jude did a lot this year as a student lobbyist for Western. There was a bill that was going to be passed that was supposed to be, looking at when police forces use force upon people, and they just forgot to include campus police in this bill, like straight up. And Jude was the only one out of all of these people within our Washington state government who remembered and asked them to add it to the bill. And then our campus responded by asking for more funding so that their police officers could go through this process. But it was wild to me that Jude doesn't even have a 4-year degree yet, and she recognized this omission that was within our system. So I think campus police are just completely forgot about even within the policing discussion in general. And I didn't even know that like 90% of our 4-year institutions have campus police until I think reading your paper and diving into it a little bit further. But to move on a little bit further with this, there's a lot of mention of the second ID within the paper itself, and it was an interesting concept that I hadn't heard of before as well. Would you mind talking about what it was, what inspired that, and why it was so important as like a central part of this article, this research?
I think one of the things that we don't say in that manuscript, but I think it's clear from how we talk about our ideas, is that what happened to us are not isolated incidents. And they are instead part of a legacy of surveilling and policing Black bodies as Black bodies traverse space. And we can see that legacy dating back to recently emancipated enslaved people who were required to carry lanterns so they could be seen at night, who were required to carry emancipation papers to show that they had the legitimate rights to traverse space or to be in spaces that without those papers would have been criminal or illegal for them to be in. And for us, that history and that reality resonate so much with the experiences that we had on campuses, right? And I think what often came out in our stories and with other stories is that when Black people are accosted by campus police officers in predominantly white spaces, one of the things they ask you for is, let me see your ID. No, not your state driver's license. We want to see your campus ID. We want to see the piece of paper, the emancipation papers that have the emblem of the university saying that you are a member, that you belong to, that you are connected to this institution, because that is the paper, that is the ID, that is the documentation that allows you that gives your body credibility or legitimacy in this particular space. And without that, then you are not allowed to be here. And that the force, right, or the request to administer or to show those papers is not about public schools or private schools or public space and private space. It's connected to sort of what we understand in the social imaginary, what colleges and universities to be, right? There are these separate sacred places that are not for anybody and for everybody, but they are for particular folk who look a particular way, which again is related to the history of universities in this country. And the further you are from being white, male, cisgender, able-bodied, then the more suspicion the presence of your body raises, right? And I think it's that for us, we were really sort of trying to draw the connections or the parallels between how our bodies are being read and disregarded in these college spaces, and how that is connected to what scholars have referred to as the afterlife of slavery, or slavery's afterlives, because it's connected, as we know, to what transpired in this country several hundred years ago.
If I could jump in real quick, I also just have to say, like, literally, as we were, sharing our stories, I just mentioned, I remembered I was like, and I think I write this as well. I was like, I felt ashamed, think about what Justin said. Like, even in that moment, I felt ashamed because he asked me for my ID. I think he asked for my license. And I brought out my school ID before because I knew he would look at me differently because of that. And that I felt I felt bad about that, right? And I remember when I said that, Marcus in that moment, he just casually says brilliant things. He was like, second ID, like in that moment, so that I think that was kind of like the germination of the paper in some ways. But yeah, I also just want to add, like the second ID can take different forms, right? It can take me wearing a hoodie of the university, right? With the university's insignia on it. It could be me looking like whatever a college student is supposed to look like, not wearing certain things. And also just, and this in Marcus talking about it made me think like, in what ways am I deemed legible in this space, right? If I'm wearing like a college shirt, right? Okay, maybe he's a student here. Or if I'm dressed as if I'm a food service worker, right? Okay, yeah, he belongs here. He's black guy. It makes sense that he's working in the cafeteria. And like when do black people make sense on campus, right? And I think some ways, and I think if you ask other black folks, other folks of color in general, and just other marginalized identities, think about the ways we like kind of cloak ourselves so we're not harassed by police, and it becomes subconscious to a point.
Thank you for your insights. You just also sent me on a mini spiral where I'm thinking, oh my gosh, wait, how many things do I kind of wear in order to get to certain places on campus? I know if I have my blue tour guide jacket, I can go anywhere I want, just go into the gym, use the gym, and come out. And I think that was one huge takeaway I had from your article because I never thought of it in that way. And so I think that's hopefully I hope that when people read the article, they see it as they can draw parallels to other ways in which, I guess like the physical object of like a student ID, folks will say, well, everyone has that. They could ask anyone for the student ID, but then also how that is interpreted and how certain perspectives will view that transaction is very different. And I think that's something that we've run into when we talk about policing on our campuses is that we always get from the administration, oh, it's a safety issue. Our parents won't pay money to send their children if we defund the police. It's going to look bad. The police are going everywhere, but it is really hard for students as well to get it in the face of our administrators and point out, well, hey, how come you invite 3,000 students and their families to our campus and there's not a single police officer? And then the Latinx Student Union hosts a lowrider show, and suddenly you see 4 or 5 just around the perimeter trying to seem friendly. But, even being able to tell those differences, I think, is really crucial for, I think, folks that are not impacted by policing in the same way to be able to recognize that. And so I think that's kind of one other way I would draw the connection to the second ID. And so you kind of had talked about how awareness in writing on campus policing has increased a little bit in the last year. We've seen, I think, a lot of like youth in high school, especially leading that charge, which is something really inspiring. And I guess I want to ask, from your perspective, do you think it's possible for an institution to have a welcoming campus climate for Black students if they have campus police?
Just to clarify, you're asking if a college campus, for example, can be a welcoming environment with the presence of police officers there.
Yes.
Okay. Justin, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah. Thank you all for these questions. Yeah, very thoughtful questions. The immediate answer that I would give is no. And I'm going to say that and connect it to sort of the macro level of society as well, right? So, like US, right? US lands, settler colonial lands, et cetera, like it's currently not welcoming to folks who are not white, specifically Black folks, Latinx folks. Even now, as we're seeing with sort of AAPI folks, just because like literally policing is a structure of violence that is rooted, as we kind of do in our paper, in sort of like right, things that are not sort of white. That's just how policing is, and sort of we do it, and then, you know, there's tons of resources that hopefully folks listening to this can sort of dig into that sort of literally traces that. And so by nature, existing in just the world is sort of not welcoming where there is a police presence. Even if I don't encounter a police daily, there's always a possibility, right? I like to say that I'm always on the precipice of sort of experiencing violence at the hands of a police officer. And it's not sort of in my imagination, but it's actually factual that if I encounter a police officer, something violent can and most likely will happen, even if not physically, but it can be a psychic sort of violence that takes place. And so when we talk about on campus, it's that similar thing, right? Just the presence and the knowing that if I, as a Black student, encounter police, that interaction will be just fundamentally different from if a white student does it. And so I'll stop there, but because I think it's definitely more nuanced. And so this is not me saying that, you know, if police are there, Black students still won't have beautiful lives and beautiful, dynamic, and wonderful experiences. But there's something there that I'm sure my brothers will sort of unpack a little bit more for me. But the immediate answer is no, it will not be welcoming, but there is more.
Justin, I think you gave a profound answer. And just to piggyback on what you've already, just to pick up what you put down, basically, in a in a recent paper, I talk about schools as sites of spatialized terror, and I use the notion of terror to think about what does it mean for a student, a Black student, to be in school where they have already witnessed violence or violence being enacted on folk who look like them, right? Black students are forced to go to these schools because K-12 schools are compulsory. So they have to go to these schools where historically, even for them, their previous experiences, for their families, for people who look like them, they have heard stories, they have understood those folks to experience fear, to be engaged in a space of overwhelming fear perpetually. So when we think about being in a space and already having an idea or the reality that this space can turn violent at any moment, right? If I move the wrong way, if I cough too loud, if I am my full self, it is possible that I could experience violence. So because I know that, because that idea, like Justin calls it the precipice, because that idea sits in the back of my mind, I move my body differently. Because what we all do when we are around fear is we adapt, we respond to try to mitigate or limit that fear. So you have students who are on schools, who are on school campuses, who are experiencing perpetual terror every single moment they are at those schools. And then imagine to be walking across campus, even already being situated in a space that is fear-inducing, that is a space of terror, and you're walking across campus and you see a representative of an entire system of violence that has been enacted on people who look like you. That just compounds the terror that you already feel by being at that school. So when we think about sort of safe, what we're saying is like, we understand that there are certain students there are certain bodies, Black students, students of color, who go to these institutions, and what they experience every day is terror. And it's not in the shocking and the terrible, but it's in the quotidian and the mundane. It is the everyday terror that they experience. And then to be able to sort of think about how that terror is exacerbated and compounded and made even more fear-inducing is the fact that I had to walk past this police authority figure who already has these notions, these preconceived notions about folk who look like me. And any encounter I have whether it's through an eye contact and eye exchange, whether it's through a physical encounter, whether it's through walking too closely, could turn violent, right? So I think sort of, what does it mean, right? If we understand sort of schools in as terror, as space of terror in that way, what does that mean when we see Black students who go to these spaces and then are expected to learn and thrive against a backdrop of this terror that they are experiencing? So I think, you know, it's really hard to, right? Because then the question becomes, how do we sort of address that terror? I think one of the ways that we do that is to start by removing representatives of systems, of institutions like police that we know are major drivers in enacting violence and producing terror against particular folks.
I'm loving this. I just have to chime in because I'm loving this, man. Y'all so smart. I mean, I mean everyone yeah, like the questions, everything, you know. But yeah, just to add, you know, just retweet everything y'all just said. But I thought just in just quick example. I work at the University of Cincinnati. At the University of Cincinnati, I believe his name is Ray Tensing. I don't know. White cop, UCPD killed a Black man, Sam DuBose, right, on campus. I work at that school. There have been instances where I forgot the alarm, like the code to get into my office, and the alarm went off. Maybe if I wasn't a Black guy, that wouldn't have terrified me. That terrified me. I mean, you know, so the police didn't even come. One of my colleagues came in and turned it off, but that threw me off like for like half the day, right? And another instance, I got to campus, it was my first class of the semester. I realized I didn't have my my wallet on me. And I was like, well, I mean, I can just use my phone to order food or whatever. And I'm like, I might need my school ID, right? I might need my professor ID because God forbid I can't open the door and the police come in. So those are some of the ways where it's like, it's not a welcoming space and the police weren't even there, but it was just the knowledge that we have this fixture of anti-Blackness, as you know, Justin was saying, like just being on the precipice that was fear-inducing or you know, terrorizing, as DeMarcus was saying, right? And also, as Justin was saying earlier, like our lives are not the sum total of the terror we you know, we experience, right? So I have a paper out that I look at Black joy on white campuses, right? So even in the context of these otherwise oppressive spaces, Black students can be agentic and create spaces of joy for themselves. But even then, you can notice how, you know, police, like their spaces of joy are also policed. So I don't see a need for campus police at all.
And we've probably seen more of this in the last year than before, but like students pushing back, faculty and administration pushing back from this belief that we need to have a police department on campus. But I know like students at Western, I'm sure students at your school have gotten really frustrated over trying to like go through that battle. And specifically when Jude and I were looking into the history of our police department at Western, they only got armed in the 90s. And it was really weird to like just see even like the wording of how they talked about it. It says like, following a series of high profile crimes in and around campus, the department officers were finally armed. Like there was no possibility of creating safety without having an armed police on campus before that. It's wild thinking about it, but
I just want to jump in, right? And I
yeah.
think thank you for saying that finally, right? It's like we've arrived, and just going back to a lot of what we're saying, that impossibility of serving and protecting, because the goal is always violence, you know, like that is the goal. So this like, and that even sounds eerie that they would write that, like finally we can now commit more violence and we can justify it because we're police. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to.
Not at all. I think like our question is, what do you think the limits of campus police reform and divestment? I think you touched on it a little bit, but for I think people who are searching for like a middle ground on this, is there a middle ground?
Oh, there's no middle ground in revolution, but go ahead, Demarcus. My bad.
You know, I don't have an answer to the question. I just wanted to fill some airspace while my brother thought about it a little bit. and and my initial thought, right, is I think when we start thinking about sort of reform, police divestment, police disinvestment, when we start thinking about those things, I think the question that, like, for me precedes that is, are we able to imagine a world without police? And I asked that question related to, like, when we think about what does it mean to be secure and safe, safety and security, like what does that mean? And for me, I have to start it there, because whenever, especially like in the example you gave with the policies around campus police, that they can finally be armed, there's this idea that having a gun provides an added or additional level of safety. But we know that the data does not bear that out, right? I'm sure that if you went back and researched the data, the encounters where the campus police have had to interrupt violent attacks where guns were needed, you would see that it's fewer and far between. Whereas the intervention of a gun doesn't seem like a logical response to that, right? Like the data just doesn't bear that out. I think in this country, we have come to sort of use safety, security interchangeably and synonymously with guns and violence, right? And in order to be safe, we need to sort of strong arm or make others feel less threatening as a way to make other people feel safe. So when we think about middle ground, for me, it's about, hey, well, first, are we ready to and really able to sort of reimagine worlds without police in the traditional ways in which we've come to know them? But then also, B, how can we start, or what does it mean to sort of reorient, redefine our understanding of sort of safety and security as it relates to institutions of policing? Now, I want to I want to pivot and let one of my brothers talk, because they look like they got some heat they about to drop.
I'll try to be brief. But yeah, thank you for that, Demarcus. I completely agree. Like, it's important for us to imagine what a world would look like, right? And I think that's what abolition does. We can't think about, when we're thinking about reform, it still is at the core an anti-Black structure in office and group. So we need to completely, when people get scared, oh, abolition, oh my God, right? No, we need to completely reframe, and as Demarcus said, reimagine, not using that as the limits of our possibility, right? So if we're scared of someone, who are we scared of? Who are they really protecting? Who are police really protecting? Are they scared of, like, people in the neighborhood? Well, let's unpack that. Why does the university have a poor relationship with folks in the neighborhood, right? That's one thing. And you don't need a gun to solve that problem. That's not going to do anything, right? Another thing, and this is just in general, the one of the things I think about, right? What schooling do campus police officers, if I'm using the reform logic, right? What schooling do they receive to work with college students? Oftentimes, and there's a lot of problematics in me saying this and thinking about, like, the, what's attributed to the accreditation of a college degree. But police officers are among the least educated people on campuses. There's more, like, I guarantee you, the person that leads that student orientation, the person that is the resident hall director, oftentimes they need a master's degree. They're learning student development theory. They're learning andragogy. They're learning about how to teach and work with, 18 to 20, 23-year-old students, kids, right? Young adults. Why does it make sense that the folks who are in student life get all of these, learn all this, but the folks who are policing don't? And they're able to wield a deadly weapon, right? So I mean, like, yeah, I completely concur with what Demarcus was saying. We need to completely reimagine what a campus should even look like, what it should even entail. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, jumping in, the answer that what everybody else is saying is that there is no middle ground, and I think the only middle ground would be to sort of continue resistance and abolition, as Antar is saying. So I think about my story, and where the white male manager. So again, just quickly for those listening, I went into a campus dining facility, and I was using a friend's student ID, who was also Black, which students do all the time. Anyway, for some reason, a white female student, said I couldn't use it, and a white male manager was called, and then 9 police showed up, and he said that he told them that there was an unruly student. And so when I think about this conversation and this idea of a middle ground, I often think about like if those 9 officers carried guns, just how we know policing works. I don't know if the probability would have been in my favor, particularly because, as Antar said, I was a college student. I was young. I was frustrated, right? And I am Black. And I just don't think that would have been handled accurately, going back to some of the things that Antar mentioned about training, education, and really just sort of learning about humanity in ways that people who sort of just have to do when you go to certain processes, whether it's college or not. And so I really don't think that there is. And to the point that everyone is saying, why do we feel like we need police? Who feels like we need police? And really, what are we protecting? Particularly if the people who are most affected by bad policing are articulating that they don't desire it. And it goes back to this whole counter story, just to tie that back, right? Like, also in critical race theory, connected to it, there's this idea of the voice of color thesis. And it's like, because people of color experience marginalization, experience oppression and violence, like when we are thinking about new ways forward, we have to listen to them because they are the ones who sort of it affects. It is most likely not affecting sort of white folks in similar ways. And so, yes, while they can be in the conversation and vote and do all these things, right? Like materially and psychically, we need to really prioritize the voices of those who are deemed as others in our society. And, that's really sort of the close and shut case there, right? We're demanding that doesn't happen. And so you need to listen to that.
Thank you for all of your insights. And I, for the sake of time, don't want to be respectful of your evenings as well. I figured I'd kind of go to a last question where your research paper kind of ends with asking, what research are we going to see about how negative encounters with campus police and in general, just harmful institutions that are anti-Black within universities affect the future educational trajectories of Black male college students? And I kind of like switched my tone of voice because I was like, oh man, I worded my questions way too long. But I think simplify it down for myself as well. I'm thinking about how we talk so much about, and our universities talk about like, okay, we need to improve the success of our students of color and our Black students and our Indigenous students. We have to increase retention. And I think y'all have a very valuable experience of having been in academia for, it sounds like, quite a bit of time. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the way that people talk about like retention, inclusion, and if you have any advice that you would give to students that are, continuously experiencing this violence in academic spaces, but really want to pursue their studies. That's a deep question, so like feel free to take a moment.
No, that's a great question. And I love the question. And just love that both of you all just really engage with our work. It always means a lot knowing that, folks are engaging with it at the level that y'all are. And I think one for me, and I think all of us, like collectively as scholars, we're all interested in Black spaces, right? Justin has a piece with another scholar, Cesare Warren, about Black educational spaces, right? I have a piece where I'm talking about Black placemaking, where I'm thinking about how Black people, Black students come together to cultivate these like spaces of belonging, spaces of hope, spaces of affirmation, right? So think about, wherever you go, right? Like what spaces are affirming to you? Where I think that's super important, because for me, I approach the world when I'm saying, okay, think about critical race theory. Derek Bell proposed the thesis that racism is permanent in society, right? It's never going away. That's not supposed to make us like, oh, like super sad, right? It's supposed to be like, it's not supposed to push us into despair, but it's supposed to empower us, right? It's supposed to empower us for resistance, and also supposed to relieve us of like kind of like the psychic peril of like, you know, cognitive dissonance. Like, why is this happening to me? No, I know why this is happening. It's because this is racism, right? So because I'm operating with that frame of thought, I'm able, it doesn't say I'm happy dealing with it, but I know things for what they are, right? So walking with that knowledge, I think, is important, right? And just given that knowledge, what spaces do you want to be in? Do you want to be in? Because, you know, a lot of the institutions that are really lauded can be super harmful spaces for particular groups of people, right? And I think it you know, we have to look out for ourselves. We have to create coalitions and solidarity amongst each other, because at the end of the day, we all we got, right? And so I think that's important for us to do the work, but understand that it's going to be, you know, collectives that are uplifting you. I'm big on collectives. I'm big on, you know, these groups and creating groups to support each other, you know, because I don't think we can count on institutions to support us the way we need to be supported.
Yeah, I think it really connects to how Antar set it up. James Baldwin, this kind of goes against some, you know, Afro-pessimist sort of work, but he says, you know, I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive, right? And so I'm optimistic. And to Antar's point, I think that's sort of one of the key spaces that I inhabit and sort of that students can inhabit. It's like, you know, because I am still here, sort of in this fight with the understanding that this structure is sort of permanent, I'm optimistic because then I know that I have the consciousness and I can continue resisting and continue sort of working to dismantle at every chance I get. And so I think that sort of grounded optimism that we call it in another paper with my colleagues Grace Player and Monica Ibarra-Gonzalez. And one thing also with that grounded optimism and working relentlessly is to rest and to understand that because these things will always be here, right? That going back to Antar's point about the collective, this is why you tap in and you tap out, right? Your entire existence can't be one bound up in sort of a struggle or sort of suffering. But, you know, we have to care for each other and make sure that we remove ourselves from these spaces, right? After we've contributed to the fight, and then come back when we feel that we're ready. And also, I think we see this a lot in academia. There are multiple ways that you might contribute to the fight. And particularly, I think for college students, right? There are many people who might be right in the middle, right? Really doing the organizing, really sort of resisting and sort of writing, trying to create campus policies. And then there might be students doing other things, right? Just like holding down, you know, the Latinx student union or the Black student union, right? And like just doing that self work, that internal work that Antar and Marcus have talked about. And so, yeah, I say just to sum it up, have a sort of grounded optimism, rest, and just play your position, right? Whatever that is. So those are sort of my three things.
I think great perspectives from my colleagues. They don't leave much room for me to add additional sort of advice. But one of the things that I do want to sort of make sure that becomes explicit is that a piece of advice I give to graduate students or to college students sort of experiencing campus police is to tell your story. Make sure that if whoever will listen, if that is the professor, if that is the RA, if that is your academic advisor, tell your story. And that's really important when we think about sort of the way power and dominance and white supremacy and anti-Blackness work, right? To silence stories and encounters, racialized encounters that have occurred, so that other narratives are allowed to sort of maintain. Earlier, Justin, shared that he hadn't really spoken out about his encounter with police until we had that dinner, that eventful night. And I think without that night, his story may have remained silenced, right? Silenced is what Oprah said. So I think we want to make sure that we are sort of sharing our stories. I think that is really, really important. I think the other, they both of my colleagues have sort of mentioned this in their ways. But I think that the element of sort of community and self-care cannot be overemphasized enough. This, trying to avoid as much as possible moments of isolation or aloneness, right? And I think sort of the we could talk our day around sort of what the pandemic has done to us around sort of isolation and aloneness, but I think in that context, coming off the heels of returning to work locations, finding community quickly, connecting with folk, sharing stories, tapping into mental health, right, and just making sure things are okay. I just think that that's super important, not just as an armor to sort of combat racism and everyday racism, but just as a life sort of mantra, right? Just really just sort of tapping into making sure that you are okay, you are your best self. And then the last thing I'll say, it just goes back to sort of what Antar mentioned, is finding, not only just sort of finding community, but finding spaces and moments of joy and celebrating those moments. Because I often talk to my students around sort of the, if you are a person of color in this world, you will experience racism multiple times a day. You will find it, right? It will find you. You will experience it. And it's important. And those things, those experiences are unintentional. You ain't looking for those experiences, but they will find you. In order to sort of, balance isn't the right word, but in order to sort of have to not let that be the whole of your existence, is to be intentional, right, about identifying moments of joy and celebrating them and basking in them. So that's what I remind myself. That's what I remind my colleagues. That's what I remind you all on this podcast today and all the listeners, and hope that you can share that with students and other collegians who are sort of in the fight for resistance and the struggle toward freedom, right? To remember to find joy.
Thank you. I just want to, I know we're approaching 3:00 our time. If there's anything else you'd like to share that you don't think you got to address, feel free to say it now. And also, if there's anything that you would like to not leave this space that we recorded, feel free to just let us know and we can cut it out. Totally up to you all. So yeah, I'm just going to leave that space for you all.
We said what we said.
Period.
Purr. No, I just want to, we started the call just thanking you all for holding space for not only us to come, but for have these conversations to be mobilized throughout your campus community and the world, right? So just thank you. Shout out to both of you for doing this important work. I think, we often write for the academic audience, and then having moments to make sure that our work has the legs in this way is super important. So thank you all for making the space and for reaching out and allowing us to come and just share more about the work. It's super important. It's super timely. It's super relevant. So we all really hope that something we said today and we've written in that article inspires others to not only sort of share their stories and their counter narratives, but also inspires institutions to think differently around sort of the use of police and post-secondary institutions.